Good evening, everyone. And thank you for joining us once again for our, excuse me, for our guided or our bi-weekly. Wow, little cough can throw me off a little bit, I suppose. How about that? Well, thank you for joining us for our bi-weekly Dharma talk on transforming suffering into joy. Today is November 24th. It's 6 p.m. here in the Central Time Zone. And welcome again, right? Glad to see you. Glad to have you with us, whether you're live or watching us sometime in the future. So glad to have you on this important talk, important realization. There's a lot of misunderstandings about what suffering is and how we can best learn from the Dharma and from the Buddhist teachings of how we can transform our suffering into more productive, right? Into joy, right? Instead of always living in misery and agitation, right? We can transform that into something more positive and nurturing. So with just a brief announcement or two before we begin, I want to thank all of our channel members, right, for participating and following us in that really wonderful way that you express your support. If you're interested, we do have a channel membership that you can join for just $1 a month or 99 cents a month. You can get access to a lot of behind the scenes, early videos, early commentary, as well as what we just initiated, a monthly members only live stream. And we'll probably up that to 2 in the upcoming months, to 2 weeks or to twice a month. So thank you. And then really important news for everyone as well is beginning on December 8th, we will be shifting our live streams. Instead of 6 p.m. At night here in the Central Time Zone, we'll be shifting that to 6:30 a.m. Still every other Monday, right? So the days aren't going to change. We're just going to change it to morning hours. This way, as you get ready for work, right? Perhaps you're driving to work or whatever your mornings, may be. Perhaps you're looking for something to help, guide you along for the week, So that's why we're going to do shifting our Dharma talks to 6:30 a.m. Or if you're former military or service, 0630, right? Right as that sun is getting up. It's a good way to start the day. Those were the days back for me. Although we were up at like 5 a.m., sometimes 5:30. So way up, way early before those for our activities. All right, so let's begin with the 3 jewels. I take refuge in the Buddha. I take refuge in the Dharma. I take refuge in the Sangha. Sathu, Sathu, Sathu. Very good. Sathu, you hear me say that, or sometimes you'll hear others say it as well. And it's just a way of, it's like amen, right? After a prayer or something like that, you can say amen. So amen and for us is Sathu. So tonight's topic is transforming suffering into joy. And it is really one of the deepest and most compassionate teachings that the Buddha gives us, right? It lies at the very, very heart of the Four Noble Truths, and it's a center for mindful living, right? And it's really at the foundation of, heading towards that true liberation, so that we're not stuck, right, in disappointment or disillusionment or stress and anxiety. Because when we are liberated from stress, anxiety, right, disappointment, agitation and so forth, we can transform. Those are all qualities of suffering. we can transform those anchors, right? And I mean those not in the sense of, our principles, but as an anchor that holds us back from where we really want to go, right? So that true liberation. And so what happens is that people kind of alluded to it a little bit, but people suffer unnecessarily. And it's simply because they don't know how to suffer. It's not something that's taught. Think about that. Think about in your entire life, right? All the classes maybe you've taken, all the lectures from parents, right? Siblings or people that we come into contact with, right? Have they ever taught you how to suffer? Probably not, right? How do we go about, understanding our suffering? And so rather than seeing suffering as an enemy, which is what we often do, right? The Buddha teaches us to instead see it as a teacher, right? The very soil out of which wisdom and compassion and joy can grow. Right? So think about that. It's that very soil, right? And we have to have fertile soil, right? We have to have fertile soil for us to nurture anything, right? Yoda. My daughter bought that for me back in the day when she was a little kid. So the Buddha's first teaching after awakening was the simple and profound truth that life contains suffering, right? We experience it every day, right? Whether it's unexpected bad news, whether you stub your toe on, the kitchen table, or perhaps you don't perform as well on an examination, or maybe you're even late to work, or you didn't get your promotion, right? And it's not because life is bleak, but because life is impermanent and uncertain and interdependent, right? And the Buddha did not ask us to believe suffering exists. He simply invited us to look honestly at our experience. We know that suffering exists. You don't have to be necessarily told that. We experience it. But sometimes when we speak it out loud, it becomes a little bit more viable, right? It's got a little bit more solidity to it. And so in the Dhammapada, the Buddha reminds us, right, that all conditioned things are of a nature to arise and pass away, right? And when one sees this with wisdom, right, one becomes wary of suffering. And this is the path to purity. And that's from the Dhammapada, right? Verse 277, if you'd like to read it. Right? And so the verse does not express pessimism, right? Right? Instead, it points out the reality that instability and change are a part of life. Suffering arises when we cling to what cannot be held or reject what has already arisen or arrived. That's where the suffering comes in. That's the second noble truth, right? Attachment. We become attached to whatever that situation or experience is, right? It's not that that won't come, right? Because it will. Suffering will happen. But on the good news, right? The good side is it also goes away. But here's a key aspect to that. What is acknowledged can be understood. So that's why it's important to sometimes say it out loud, right? You don't have to scream it at the top of your lungs or like you're in The Sound of Music. It's kind of cool. If you've never seen The Sound of Music, I think you know the reference, right? Singing on top of that hill. But go ahead and sing a beautiful song. You can absolutely do that, right? And so what is acknowledged can be understood, and what is understood can be transformed, right? Once we understand that this is what I'm feeling, this is what I'm thinking, this is the experience, we can transform that thought or that experience from something negative or uncomfortable to something else, right? Like I said, remember, how many of us were ever taught how to suffer? And that's where that transformation comes. It's a new tool, right? It's a new paradigm for our own life's experience. And so the Buddha's invitation, turn towards suffering, right? And so many of us instinctively, we just run away from discomfort. People don't want to be uncomfortable. I hear it. I dig it, right? Nobody wants to be uncomfortable, whether it's through distraction of some sort, right? Entertainment, overworking, or even avoiding emotions. How many times have maybe somebody has approached you with a difficult conversation, right? Something that maybe arises and stirs up some hard emotions, and you avoid it, right? Oh, I'll call you back later, or and you never do, right? Or, oh, let me call you back, or we'll set up an appointment. We'll schedule some time where we can talk about this more deeply, but you don't, right? And then that builds up and builds up and builds up. And so again, that's discomfort. People don't understand how to live with that discomfort, or not live with that discomfort, but how to suffer through it appropriately, right? So the Buddha invites us to turn towards that suffering instead, right? With gentle and mindful presence. And that's important, right? With gentle and mindful presence. Too often we want immediate results, right? That's why we take pills sometimes. That's why we maybe distract ourselves with, whether it's entertainment or alcohol or narcotics even, right? Or even relationships, right? So sometimes we can distract ourselves, right? How often have maybe you perhaps, right? On the rebound, right? Have you heard that expression? Oh, he's on the rebound, or she's on the rebound, or they're on the rebound, right? Because people don't know how to properly sit with or examine their suffering, right? But in the Satipatthana Sutra, he says that a practitioner who observes feelings as feelings, and whether they are pleasant or unpleasant or neutral, right? Why? Because mindful observation, right, reveals the true nature of those feelings. They arise and they pass away. In one of my regular talks that I and I'll probably make a video on this in the future, and not probably, I will make a video on this in the future. It's called Defeating Self-Defeat. And a lot of times it's for students, who just get really anxious with taking tests. And that's one of the little tips or the strategies that I give them, is that, we really have to sit there and look at our feelings, right? And we have to practice being uncomfortable, because we don't know how to be uncomfortable, right? And once we are comfortable with being uncomfortable, right? Sounds like word salad, right? But once we are comfortable with being uncomfortable, we learn how to transform that discomfort into something more productive, right? And so if we can stay present with suffering, right, without fear, without resistance or denial, right, something really remarkable happens, right? Because then suffering begins to lose its grip on you. So think about that. When we lose, or when suffering, that pain and that discomfort, the anxiety, right, begins to soften and move away, we're actually, able to focus, much more intently, with that gentle, mindful presence. So suffering as a teacher. So how do we use suffering as as a teacher. And so we often imagine that joy comes from eliminating difficulties. And it does, right? We are certainly happy, right? When it's a difficult situation is no longer difficult. It's no longer there. But Buddhist practice teaches something much more empowering. Joy arises when suffering, excuse me, joy arises when suffering is understood, embraced, and transformed. Because if we don't understand something, we're not going to be able to work with it. That's why we mentioned that a few moments ago, right? What is acknowledged can be understood, and what is understood can be transformed. And so once we understand something, right, what is the cause of that difficult situation or those hard-pressed emotions, right? We can embrace it and transform it. And that's really how we begin to transform our suffering into joy. So, and in the Lotus Sutra, right, the Buddha describes his teachings as a way to help beings open that gate of wisdom, right, so they can perceive their own nature. So your nature is going to be slightly different than mine, right? Yours will be slightly different than somebody else's. There'll be a lot of overlap, but a lot of this comes down to perspective. And so you have to understand your own nature, right? And this wisdom, it's not abstract, right? It comes from knowing our lives deeply, including our own suffering. Because if we don't know our own nature, our own capacity, right, we're just going to continue and continue suffering. And there'll be moments of joy, right? When a moment that is, again, hard or uncomfortable passes, but something else will arise, right? Just bringing us back into those moments of discomfort. So we have to really learn how to understand ourselves. And so what you can do is think of suffering like compost. If you ever had a compost pile in your yard or whatnot, and I think most of you may know what a compost pile is, but it's all the biodegradable leftovers that you perhaps throw in your backyard and make it for fertilizer. But on its own, right, it smells unpleasant, right? But if we learn how to work with it, right, it becomes nourishment for those flowers. That's our suffering, right? So think about it as compost as our suffering, and our suffering is compost. And if we nourish it, right, take care of it just right, it becomes fertilizer, nourishment for flowers, or maybe you like vegetables. You can grow vegetables too. We like to grow tomatoes. Try to grow pumpkin, but you can never get our pumpkin right. Every now and then we get the really long vines and they come out a little bit, but they're never big and orange like the picture shows. So maybe I'm not nurturing it right. But when you understand anger, right, compassion is possible. So think about that. When you understand what makes you angry, you can have compassion for someone else. When you understand fear, right, courage becomes possible, right? And when you understand loss, gratitude becomes possible. There's a lot of people who don't understand that gratitude, when you have that really big heart of gratitude, oftentimes it's because you lost something, right? You lost maybe someone very dear to you. And for some of us, maybe that significant loss could be a relationship, could be a sibling, could be a pet, could be a parent or a grandparent. And so when we understand what gratitude is, right, or when we understand what loss is, we're able to express gratitude. And so it is, in this way that suffering becomes the very foundation of joy, right? You wouldn't think of that, would you? Right? Really wouldn't. We would not think that the foundation of all that is joyful, of what could be joyful, right, in our lives, really originates with our suffering. Moment to think about that. Right? So the path to that transformation, mindfulness. Right? Mindfulness. And mindfulness is really the art of staying present without judgment. So it's just being aware, right, in that present moment, not too far in the future, not too far in the past. Right? And then when we breathe mindfully, we create space around difficult emotions. Right? And we have to be aware. That's why it is important to acknowledge those hard feelings, those difficult emotions, those difficult feelings, because then we can approach them with that mindful presence and that awareness. And the Buddha, another wonderful quote or statement from the Buddha, right, in the Anapanasati Sutra, right, that mindful breathing calms the body and gladdens the mind. Even one mindful breath can change the direction of your day. So think about that. We may not always act upon that, right? We may not really be aware of that. But how many of us have actually learned to just take a pause, right? Maybe something monumental has happened, good or bad, but significant. And we impulsively react, right? But maybe we have a friend who says, whoa, slow down, take a minute. That's really what that is, right? It stops us from making impulsive decisions. And so, but the Buddha is stating that we can just do some mindful breathing, right? A few breaths, even one breath. It allows us to pause. How quick do we make decisions? Right? It's like less than a second sometimes. If something immediate happens, or an immediate, again, monumental or very important situation happens, we make decisions like less than a second. I forget what it's like, less than half a second, something it is. Right? We don't think about it. So that's why we need that pause. And so when suffering does arise, right, we can just try saying silently to ourselves, breathing in, I know suffering is here. Breathing out, I hold this suffering with compassion. Right? Right? That's not something that's a passive statement. It's not, profoundly active, right? It's not choosing, to run away, right? We're not running away from that. It's simply choosing to embrace ourselves. Take that moment of reflection before we make a decision. Explore our feeling, whatever that feeling is. And then understanding, right, the deep work that the process enables us, right? So once we recognize suffering, we do have an opportunity to look into its cause. And the Buddha calls this samadaya, right? The origin of suffering, right? And most often, our suffering arises from craving, attachment, right? The second noble truth, right? Or aversion, right? So craving, right? For things that are, for them to be different than they are. Aversion, right? To what we find uncomfortable. Remember those hard conversations that maybe you put off, right? Or ignorance of the nature of reality, right? Oftentimes that's a large one. And really what is referred to in the ignorance of reality is that we often think that conditions are permanent, even though we know better. Right? We know better that conditions, they come in and they go, but we treat them as permanent. And so understanding the roots of suffering, it's like turning on a light in a dark room. Right? Suddenly those obstacles that seemed overwhelming become workable. Have you ever fumbled around, maybe late at night, right? And you stub your toe on the couch? I'll raise my hand for that, right? And why do we do that? Right? We know our couch is there, right? But maybe we misjudge something, right? And I'm thinking of this just like right now. We don't turn on the light because we don't want to awaken, right? Especially if it's like late at night, 2:30 in the morning, right? Maybe you want to go to the bathroom or get some water or whatever it is. You don't turn on the light. You stub your toe because you don't want to awaken. But if you turn on the light, you would awaken. And that's like the Dharma right there. That was on the fly. That was an impulsive decision right there. Not so impulsive. I thought about it for a few moments before. So, but anyway, yeah, think about that. That's kind of interesting, right? And like it, like I just also briefly mentioned, right? It becomes what we thought was overwhelming, right? Becomes workable. Letting go and just letting be. So right, to transform suffering, right? We don't push away. Right? Think about a screaming child in the store. What happens when you try to shush them or push them away, right? They get louder, right? And everybody starts looking at you. So instead we release, right? Our clinging to it, right? Whatever that situation is, it's just, we don't want to live there. We don't want to be there, right? Forever, right? It's important to feel the feeling. It's important to understand it, but we don't want to live there forever. Maybe you know somebody like that who just holds on to a grudge for like years, right? So releasing it and not clinging to it, right? It's not the same as suppression, right? Right? It's just a gentle loosening, right? A willingness to, just let life unfold, forcing it to meet our, without forcing it to meet our expectations. I like to think of it as, like the leaf that just like floats on the stream. Doesn't have to do anything. It's still going downstream. Right? Every now and then it may get into those little eddies and, little rough currents and so forth. But it gets to where it's got to go without any help from anything else. Although when I was little, I would put little toys on them sometimes and watch them float down. But as the Dhammapada teaches us, right? Let go of the past, let go of the future, and let go of the present. And with the heart freed, cross over to the further shore. And that's all. Again, that's from the Dhammapada, and that's verse 348, if you're interested in looking. Because it's going to arrive, right? What does that mean? Let go of the past and let go of the future and let go of the present, right? Past is gone. We can't go back to it. The future doesn't exist yet, right? And the present, really kind of just letting go of any of that the attachments that we may have. And then we are able to cross over. Remember the raft, that story, right? You don't carry a raft in the desert, right? It's not going to help you. Once you cross your river, right, your stream, you leave the raft there. And so when we do that, letting go creates that spaciousness. And it's in that spaciousness, joy fills it up, right? It naturally arises. But what is joy? Good question, right? Joy in Buddhism is not excitement or pleasure, right? That's a joyful experience, right? We can certainly a component of it, but it's just it's a deep, stable well-being born from understanding, right? We can have those joyful experiences, birthday parties, gifts, nice surprises, right? Seeing an old friend, holding a hand, a warm embrace, hot chocolate, if you're in the cold weather where I am, right? That's joyful, right? Absolutely is. But we can broaden our understanding or our definition of it. And again, in that Buddhist sense where it's a deep, stable well-being, right? Born from that understanding. And so in the Metta Sutra, the Buddha describes the person who abides in loving kindness as someone who is contented and easily satisfied. And this contentment is joy, a joy not dependent on external conditions. They're just naturally joyful because they've let go, right, of those future, of the past, and even of the present, right? It leaves that spaciousness. And when we have all that spaciousness within us, like in the Metta Sutra that's described, it fills it up, right? And then when joy arises, we begin to understand the nature of things. We understand the rising, the falling, the comings, the goings. We stop running from ourselves. How often do we do that? We oftentimes run away from ourselves with distractions, right? We run away from those hard feelings, those hard situations, or those hard conversations because maybe we don't want to deal with them. So we stop running from ourselves when joy comes into that. And compassion blossoms in the heart. And we begin to feel a connection with all beings. We are present, we are awake and open. And so that is why joy is not separate from suffering, right? They're two sides of that same coin, right? Two energies that can be transformed into one another. So how can we learn, right? Because now we need to transform our suffering into joy. So what are some methods? What are some practices that you can try? And here's some four that you can, here are four, not some four. Here are four that you can just try right away, right? Just embrace the feeling, right? When a painful emotion arises, pause. Remember that pause, right? Pause. Simply, you can put your hand on your heart or your stomach or your abdomen and simply say to yourself, right? I am here for you. You are acknowledging that you are here for yourself. Sometimes you may want to bring up like a little child or something like that in your mind and imagine comforting the child who is afraid and your suffering is that child, because that's really what it is. Children suffer because they don't know, and people as well, they suffer because they don't know how to. And then looking deeply into ourselves, and we can gently just ask ourselves, what's the story behind this suffering? Why are you suffering, right? Why are you clinging to it? Which is an important question. Why are you clinging to that suffering? You know, one question I ask myself sometimes is, before I make a decision, I ask myself, how will this help me on my path? So that's a question you can ask yourself. How is clinging to that emotion, to that situation, how is it helping you? Or is it holding you back? And that's a deep question. Right? And then what expectation is being challenged? What need of yours or what expectation was not met? Right? Oftentimes it's just a miscommunication. Right? And remembering that even if that miscommunication or misunderstanding or that action is from someone else, no matter how close we are to them, we oftentimes don't know what that other person is going through. So it's important to just, what is that expectation right? And why is it being challenged? And then is that emotion tracked you? Right? That's why we oftentimes use emotions, right? We use them for protection because we don't want to get hurt. Those uncomfortable feelings. Think about somebody who's angry. If they show you a lot of anger, a lot of excitement and agitation, maybe they are very energetic when they talk. Maybe they put other people down when they talk. What are they trying to protect about themselves? Because perhaps, maybe they're feeling vulnerable and they don't want others to see that vulnerability. So is that emotion trying to protect you? And then understanding, right? When we begin to understand, that dissolves that fog, that veil of uncertainty, right? If you've ever driven on a foggy night, you know how hard that can be, right? And you're still going forward. And it's kind of dangerous. I'm pretty rural where we are. So, especially in those foggy times, man, you really got to watch out for the deer too. So we have to be careful, right? So understanding dissolves the fog. I know we're not talking about deer for tonight, right? But compassion is the warmth, right, that transforms suffering. And then in the Karananya Metta Sutra, right, the Buddha encouraged us to radiate compassion to all beings as the mother protects her only child. So think about that. Extending compassion for everyone, all living beings, not just you. Start with yourself, start with your family, start with those around you. But with practice and open-heartedness, you can begin to extend that bubble, that warm light of compassion to everyone, right? Including yourself. It's important to understand that, we're not the only ones that have problems. Think about the people that you work with or other family members, right? Sometimes you know some of their problems. Oftentimes you don't. And so it's when we are able to extend that warm light of compassion towards everyone, we can understand our suffering better and we can understand them better as well. So it's important, right? Cultivating gratitude and joy. So even in moments in those difficult moments, right? Joy is present, right? In small and accessible and available forms. Where can we find joy in those difficult moments? A friend, right? Just because you practice mindfulness in Buddhism, you're not alone, right? We have friends. Remember the Sangha and the three jewels? The breath, right? We can find joy in the breath. A lot of people don't have that anymore, a breath. And that makes us very fortunate that we are. That is a joyful experience. Your most difficult situation, there's somebody who is experiencing worse and was wishing that they could trade places. We can find beauty in nature, even in the dead of winter, right? There's beauty. A moment of stillness. Even if you're having the hardest day of your life, try to take a stillness of just quiet, right? The opportunity to practice. There's joy in that. We have an opportunity to practice our mindfulness, our mindful breathing. And understanding that a joyful mind is not naive, right? It's actually very courageous, right? Too often we think of, courageousness as, running into battle and doing dangerous things or whatnot. But joy can be courageous, right? Because we are transforming our suffering into joy. And I always think of really my favorite Buddha story, right? Is really, it really is my favorite. And you can find some really good video clips of this. That's an Indian from an Indian uh, series. There's like 52 episodes, and I think it's around episode like 40 or something like that. But it's with the story of Anulama, right? The serial killer, the mass murderer who wore the garland of fingers, right? So they call him a bandit, but he hurt a lot of people. But anyway, so Anulama caused suffering to many, right? And meeting the Buddha, he transformed completely, right? The Buddha did not reject him, right? Instead, he saw the suffering beneath his violence. So it's something for us to think. Those that are very violent and aggressive, they suffer a lot. And so the Buddha extended compassion towards him. And then Anulama realized, right? Deeds done in ignorance can be abandoned when wisdom arises. Right? The Buddha taught him that. When we stop doing things, behaviors, sayings, replies, rebuttals, actions, when we stop doing those out of ignorance, we become wise. So Anulama, right? He again, he's serial killer, mass murderer, a lot of people. But the Buddha asked him, or was talking to him, and Buddha told him, he's like, you understand the difference between right and wrong, and therefore he can, right, be awakened. And he really became one of Buddha's star students, trusted disciples. And so the story overall, right, teaches us that no suffering is beyond transformation, no matter how dark. Right? When the heart opens and when wisdom and compassion arises, joy becomes possible. So we have to understand that no suffering, no matter how dark it is beyond transformation. Everybody has some good in them. And then seeing our connection, right? That inner being. Thich Nhat Hanh always loved to talk about inner being, and it's true, right? I am you and you and me, or you are me, to describe the profound interconnectedness of all things. So when we suffer, we often feel isolated. And suffering connects us to all beings. And in the Avatamada Sutra, the Avatamada Saka Sutra, Buddha describes the universe as an infinite net of jewels, right? Each reflecting all the others. No jewel shines alone. So think about that. When we have all these jewels, think of a bag of rubies, a bag of diamonds, whatever. I've never seen a bag of jewelry. I've never seen a big bag of that, just so you know. But I can imagine it, right? They don't shine by themselves, right? When that light shines on them, all of them sparkle. Right? All of them sparkle. And so when we understand this inner being, our suffering is no longer my suffering, but instead, right, the suffering, right? It's just all of us suffering. We understand when one person suffers, we all suffer. And so as a result, compassion becomes natural. Right? Joy arises from feeling connected and alive. Right? And what are the fruits of that transformation? Where is that? Where are we going with this, right? What are the benefits of transforming our suffering into joy? Because when we understand suffering, right, that leads to wisdom and compassion and patience, humility, right? Strength, and deep and abiding joy. And understanding that from meditation, wisdom arises, and from a lack of meditation, wisdom declines or ignorance remains. And so, knowing the path of progress and decline, one should so conduct themselves that wisdom may grow. And that's from the Dhammapada as well, verse 282. So, wisdom is not merely intellectual, right? It's lived, it's embodied, and it's joyful. So, kind of closing up, I'm a little bit over this evening, but kind of closing up, just remembering that suffering is not a punishment. It's a fact of life. And if we view it with right view and right understanding, it becomes a very valuable teacher. Right? Because remembering, most people don't know how to suffer, and therefore that prolongs their suffering. They wait for that moment to cease, for another moment, more positive perhaps, to replace it. And that doesn't teach someone how to suffer appropriately. And mindfulness shines a light on suffering, and then understanding dissolves, right, suffering's roots. Right? Because when we understand what suffering is, we can't nurture it. Just by default, we can't nurture it once we understand what suffering is. And compassion transforms suffering into joy. Right? Because we're able to help ourselves and help others as well. And joy is simply a state of clarity, and openness, and freedom. Imagine that. Freedom from suffering, right? Or freedom, as a result of joy and tied together. But you would not think of that, would you? It's a reflection point, right? How does suffering is the foundation of joy and freedom and liberation. And just to kind of wrap up a little bit more, right? All right, well, little reflection from the Dhammapada, thinking about flowers, since we talked about compost earlier, right? Fragrance of flowers does not travel against the wind, right? But the fragrance of a wise and loving heart spreads everywhere. So it's verse 54. And so with that, my friends, just want to thank you all for spending some extra time with us tonight, right? I'm very grateful for your presence and your participation and patience with us this evening. Just enjoying this very important talk, right? Transforming suffering into joy. Again, we all experience suffering. So learning how to suffer helps minimize, right, that experience. And we learn that we can really find the joy in that. Right? And so our next talk, right, is December 8th. And December 8th is Bodhi Day. Conveniently, right, on our Dharma Talk Day. And so our Dharma Talk on December 8th at 6:30 a.m. All right. So remember that we changed the times now. So 6:30 a.m. It'll be Bodhi Day, right? The truth the Buddha discovered. And so if you haven't subscribed, go right ahead and turn on those notifications. But we're here, or bi-weekly, right? So that's not going to change. It'll always be on Monday. So with that, my friends, I'll let you all go and wish you well, and be kind to yourself, and be patient and kind with others as well. All right. And it'll help us radiate joy and compassion and empathy throughout the world and with ourselves. Take care, my friends.